and welcome. My name is Carol Carter and I'm the founder and CEO of Global Minded. We are delighted to be back again with you this fall. We took a little bit of a break this summer after our conference and really looking forward to the programming going on within higher education and Dr. Ryan Ross' series this fall. So thank you for joining us today. A couple of quick announcements. One is, if you don't know about Global Minded, we are all about creating a capable, diverse talent pipeline to get more women, people of color, ability status, LGBTQIA, any way you can define diversity into the education, economic mobility, and leadership pipeline. So we have our big event, which will be live next June 22nd, 23rd, 24th. So we've got our early bird registration right now for that event. And then we have our 2021 Inclusive Leader Award winners, and you all are invited to that. That's happening on November 3rd, 6 o'clock Eastern time. It'll be less than an hour to meet these 15 amazing people this year. And then we have a number of other special events. Another one that everyone is invited to is called The Impact of Board Diversity. We're doing that with Amazon Web Services, and that's happening on September the 28th, and that will also be at the same time, so 4 o'clock Eastern time. Every day this week, we have our different equity teams, and we're really delighted to launch today's on this very important topic, which is lifting the hood on disability services. It's time for a tune-up, and my pleasure to reintroduce most of you who always show up and join us each month to Dr. Ryan Ross, who's with the Colorado Community College System, works nationally and globally on equity issues, and we're really thrilled that he runs the Get Comfortable Being Uncomfortable series and has an amazing panel for you to learn from today. Ryan, great to see you. Welcome, everyone.
Carol, thank you. And everyone, yes, it's good to be back with you this fall. Excited for this conversation. As you know, we only have an hour, and so we're going to jump right in, not to waste any time. When you think about equity and we're having this conversation, you know, one of the things that I'm always trying to focus on is how we deconstruct the equity conversation. And as we deconstruct this conversation, we have to pick up the pieces that have been missing, right? And so one of the major pieces of this conversation is race, right? And we spend a lot of time talking about race because it's the hidden elephant in the room. It's what we've got to talk about. It's what we've got to focus on, you know, but there's another elephant, right, that gets left out a lot of times, right? And that's accessibility services. And especially in higher ed, we have, and in the community college setting in particular, right, we have this open access mission, this open access commitment, right? And so for me, what that means is open access means whoever shows up, we serve, and we serve them well. And we have to figure out how to make sure that the students self-actualize into what it is they want to do and that they achieve their goals. And we all know that there's barriers along the way. So when we think about those barriers, you know, we do a decent job of looking at student services, but I don't know that we always do the best job when it comes to our students who may need some accommodations, whether those are visible or invisible. And so today we're going to spend some time talking about that. And we've got some really cool folks. And as you know, we like to try to have representation from all over the country. And today is no different. We have Lesley Owens-Pelton, we have Catherine Carlson and Emily Perry. I'm going to let them introduce themselves here and tell you a little bit about themselves, and we're going to jump right in. So let's start with Emily.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Perry. I work for CCC Online, which is the online division of the Colorado Community College System. So I have the honor of working with Ryan Ross. And I am the Access and Equity Services professional. So part of my job is working with students with disabilities and providing them access to our online courses. And then the other part of my job is closing the equity gaps among our marginalized populations and identifying procedures, processes, things like that might create barriers for them.
Thank you, Emily. Lesley?
Hi, my name is Dr. Lesley Owens-Pelton, and I don't know how old the folks out there are, but if you remember back in the 80s and 90s, that television commercial where the guy would say, "I'm not only the president of the Hair Club for Men, I'm a member." Okay, well, that's kind of me because I'm not only the director of disability services. When I was in college, way back when in 1992, I was a student with a disability. So I have seen not one, not two, not three, but 4 different institutions sitting on the other side of the desk. So disability is my life. It's part of my identity. I come at it with disability services. I come at it with that sort of outlook. And it's really, I think, shaped the course of how I see things and feel about things. And Ryan, you're right. We serve the students the best that we can. And sometimes underneath the hood is a little bit, there's a little bit under there we need to talk about. So anyways, with that said, hi, how you doing?
Right on. Welcome and thank you for being here. Catherine?
Hi, my name is Catherine Carlson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm 5'6" with shoulder-length curly brown hair and blue eyes. I am the Director of Accessibility Services at Columbia-Greene Community College in upstate New York on the Catskill Mountains. I am, I guess the way that I approach my vision for this office is I am in full service of not only our students, and especially more recently, our teaching professionals on our campus who endeavor and whom I have always received great support from to create equity in the educational environment for students with disabilities.
Right on. Thank you. And welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm glad you guys are all here. Like I said, we're going to jump right in. And so when we think about accessibility services in higher education, from your perspectives, what is the origin story of accessibility services? How did we get here? How did accessibility services become part of the conversation? And Catherine, I'll throw this to you to get us going.
Okay. Well, I think the origin of accessibility services starts out in civil rights. It started out as a civil rights movement, really, which has led to legislation, as civil rights movements often do, and anti-discrimination laws. So education law really started out at the secondary public school level. In 1975, the Federal Education for All Handicapped Children Act required public schools to guarantee a free and appropriate public education to students with disabilities. And the current version, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, together with the ADA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and other legislation, aims to ensure that the concepts of access and appropriateness are interpreted and applied consistently. Philosophically, I think educators and advocates explore the implications of a semantic and paradigmatic shift from disabled to different. In more practical terms, the education community does, I would suggest, sort of continue to worry that students with special needs will detract from the integrity of a competitive classroom environment, right? So while we have made great progress over the last 2 decades, 2 or 3 decades, more than that, actually 5 decades, we still have work to do, and there will always be work to do. Our current role, really, I see, is to make clear that equity in the higher education environment has to do with universal design, differing learning styles, and how we meet our students where they are now without perseverating over diagnoses and documentation and all of this stuff that comes with the law. I think where we need to go now is remember universal design, which originally came about 15 years ago, and continues to evolve in response to the changing needs of our communities and our students.
Thank you for that. It's striking. I mean, you said a lot there, right? This is tied to the civil rights movement. It's in institutions. We've got legislation. You think with all of that, this would be a conversation that everybody knows about. But surprisingly, when we think about equity and when we think about student services, oftentimes students and persons with disabilities, especially ones that aren't visible, seem to be left out of the conversation, right? And so, what do we need to do about that? How should we be advocating as professionals? How do we really amplify this conversations? And Lesley, I'll kick this to you, and then others just jump in.
Okay, piggybacking sort of what off Catherine said, yes, absolutely. This came out of the civil rights. People like Ed Roberts, who was one of the original founders of the RCILs. When you look at the 504, the largest takeover of a federal building were people with disabilities who took over the San Francisco Health and Human Welfare building. And I think they did that for what, like 48 days. There's been a lot, and this is really an unknown history. So what I did, because it became my passion, my life's goal. So not only did I get a bachelor's degree, I went on and got a master's degree in foundations of education, which studied how people are, what barriers are put up for people for education. Then I went on and got a certificate of advanced study in disability studies, so history, a lot of things like that. And then because this is so legally driven, I went out and got a law degree that focused specifically on IDEA, ADA, 504, and the Fair Housing Act. Those are the big ones that you will see. And IDEA is kind of for kids K through 12, but they transition over to us. And that transition period, I worked with Cornell for a few years on a grant called the Model Transition Program. It was the largest one in the history of the US, studying what the transitions were between high school and college and where the stumbling blocks were. I mean, what was it that was making this happen? So the origin story of this, although it goes back to civil rights, I think that a lot of what has happened is because it's become a little bit ingrained in our society that it just kind of runs by itself. You know, in the K through 12s, things just sort of follow a student through. And then when they get to college, all of a sudden it changes and no one tells people that this is going to happen. That's a huge stumbling block. So for me, there's a lot of history, a lot of origin story. It needs to be known. It needs to be yelled from the rooftops. But a lot of what we're concentrating on now is the here and now of it. How is it working? And what mechanisms can we look at to make this less burdensome to access? Because that's my goal.
Any thoughts there, Emily?
Yeah, so when it comes to disability being part of the diversity conversation, I think it's important to kind of talk about where disability is in society and how it has kind of historically been with people not wanting to see people with disabilities, them being shutaways, invisible, pitied, beggars on the street. And so it just makes people uncomfortable, which is great. You're having this series of talking about what is uncomfortable. But most people in their lifetime will have a disability at some point, whether that is from old age, whether they're born with it, it's co-occurring with other things. And so it scares people. People don't know what to think. They're scared of what their future might look like. And seeing how people are treated with disability, I think that right now it can be easier to say that's not the conversation for right now. Let's focus on something else that, other conversations that maybe, even though they're incredibly uncomfortable and people still don't want to talk about them, maybe they're more in the media right now, or they're more mainstream. And so people are okay to talk about them. And so with that being said, it's important that we bring it back in, because right now disability isn't talked about because people don't want to hear us. And I say us because I'm with Lesley, I'm a part of this community. They don't want to hear us. They want to ignore us. And we honestly let them be left out of the conversation. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in at the multiple different institutions I've worked at that have been diversity focused, and accessibility is not brought up once. And so how do we continue to focus on the other important identities that we need to talk about as well without losing sight of disability? Because there's room in the conversation for all of us. And the ironic thing is when we lose one part of that conversation, there is no social justice. There is no social equity. It doesn't matter if we have, gender equity, racial equity, if we don't have disability equity. And so we really need to make this a priority and not just an option.
And there's a lot of intersectionality too that goes on, different groups, but statistically speaking, if you look at people with disabilities, they make up, according to the WHO and the CDC, between 20 and 25% of the US population. So that means that there should be, and your mileage may vary, about 20% of your campus that are students with disabilities. I know that on my campus, we're hitting over 25 or over 20% now. So that is the largest student group on my campus besides athletes. That's, I mean, so I try to infuse in them that we are a group and that we have power, we have a voice, but one voice won't do it. We have to come together and be a vocal group stating.
Well, I think the reason why the disability group has been sort of the last to jump in, to jump in with strength to the diversity conversation is because it's something that isn't. It's not easy to be prideful about having a disability, right? And I think Lesley and Emily are exceptions to the rule, and you know, it's. When something is not acceptable and it's hard to be prideful about that, it can be debilitating. It can be very self-debilitating. So what I try and do for my students, and particularly my students that are learning education professionals in the learning disabilities course that I teach, is I try and talk to them about disability in their language. So when they say, how do I know what my students mean? I say to them, when you look at your class, can you identify avatars in your class, right? So this avatar is the blind student. Can the blind student see that? And this avatar is the deaf student. Did you provide captions for that deaf student? And just by saying the word avatar, like it brings them back to their video games, right? And they're thinking about it in their head that way. So I think a lot of the conversation has to morph and has to evolve according to what's happening in our society too. And I'm very, very careful to do that when I talk to my students so that it clicks with them, they identify with that.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that a little bit, right? I spend a lot of time talking to faculty and staff about how to show up and be an advocate for students with disabilities and for the profession as a whole within higher education. And a lot of times there's ignorance, right? You don't know what you don't know. You don't know how, or you know, you might even be afraid, right? Like, what advice would you give to faculty and staff who have a responsibility, quite frankly, to advocate for every student and every stakeholder on campus, but for some reason they don't have the words or they don't have the know-how to show up the way that maybe they'd be most proud to do so? What advice would you give? And just jump in.
Well, I'd say go out, seek out. These are smart people who work on these campuses. I work with them every day. You
Right.
can seek out. You can Google things like etiquette, disability etiquette. Is it okay for me to ask a student, what's wrong with you? Yeah, that's inappropriate. Don't ask that, because honestly, I don't think there's anything wrong with me. I'm different, sure. I need certain accommodations, sure, but there's nothing wrong with me. And in fact, I'm quite happy in my life. And if I have the ability to change it way back when, I don't think I would, because it has made me who I am. Other pieces of etiquette, little words. Wheelchair bound. Are they literally tied into the chair? I mean, you can go and look up a lot of blogs about that. Handicapped. It has a lot of baggage, that terminology.
Mm-hmm.
You can have accessible parking. You can have parking with just a symbol, an international symbol. That's always good. But it always, it gives me pause when, and I realize that sometimes you have metal signs. These cost a lot of money. Therefore, it's a thought that, this is a burden to replace a metal sign. But I want to remind people that budgets and where we spend our money shows a lot about what we consider important. And so if it is not important to you, that it is literally an insult to people who have to use that spot, that they pull up and you are telling them that they should have their cap in hand to be asking for alms, then you're telling me that that's not really an important issue for you. So I think sort of going and looking up online, I would tell faculty and staff to just go and explore. And if you can find a webinar about this, there are a lot of disability groups out there. They meet regularly. They're on Facebook, they're on Instagram, they're on TikTok. And so there's lots of sources that you can go to.
I mean, my advice to my faculty is always, let's start looking at this in terms of student success. Let's take the word disability out of the discussion, right? Because, you know, in these days of data-driven grants, retention and completion focus, assessment protocols, right? We assess everything we do. Student success is a commitment we owe to our students, and not only our students, our county and our state governments that support our community colleges, right? And our communities that employ our students. So student success is really what we should be focusing on. And when you focus on student success, how to create successful students, you can't miss jumping into equity, right? And accessibility. You can't miss it. It has to be accessible in order for them to succeed. So I try and get involved in those conversations on my campuses, the retention and the completion and the assessment and the student success, because I think all of that is what's going to be important to my students. If my faculty are invested in student success, they're hitting the mark.
Well, thank you. Emily, anything to add there?
I think the way that I like to come at the conversation, at least with my instructors, is having them reframe disability as there is something extra needed for that student, or that student has so many things that they can't do, and instead seeing it as the environment that they're in being the barrier. And so if we create environments that don't have these barriers, guess what? People don't need accommodations. It's just an accessible environment. And so I feel like when we are talking about accommodations, it's also like almost this is the student's fault. They have to get this accommodation because they can't do something. It's their fault. Instead of putting it back on us as the institution of, we created these barriers. We did not make the best course for our students with this learning disability, or that's hard of hearing. We didn't add the captions. Things like that, that puts it back on us. And again, it's a group responsibility. It's not just the students' responsibility to advocate for their civil rights. It's our responsibility to advocate for them as well.
What Emily's talking about, for those of you out there listening to us that may not be familiar with this, there's different kinds of models within the disability world. There's the medical model, and then there's the social model. And now, this is like being a second wave feminist, and now we're in the fourth wave. Now there's the social justice model of disability. I like that. And so this is the idea that way back when we would go, what do you mean this person can't get into the building? There's stairs. Well, I guess that's their fault. Nowadays we go, oh, there's stairs? That's our fault. We need to do something about this, because the stairs are the issue. The disability is not the issue, it's the stairs. So we have to keep going with this idea of how we look at it and what our perspective is, because it is not a medical model environment. I mean, that needs to be thrown to the wayside. We do need it in a lot of things, unfortunately, and those of us who work in disability services know that a lot of documentation is medical model based. And I wish there was a way around this, and maybe someday we'll figure it out. But when you're dealing with people, think in terms of the social justice model. When you're looking at things in terms of how do we solve this? You cannot go back to the person and start victim blaming, or not, it's not, I'm sorry. You cannot start student blaming and saying the reason that this isn't working is because of the student or because of the disability. It's how can we make this better? How can we make this work? And if you look at it now, when we start doing that, universal design becomes the model. I love doors that open. Why? Because I often have packages or books or whatever. But those were designed for people with disabilities way back when. So as we move forward and technology gets better and better, spell check. Who do you think that was designed for? What you're watching right now, these transcripts, all of my friends who used to use transcripts back in the 90s, I guess, they would call them craptions because back then they were very crappy. Now, well, it was the joke. But nowadays, have you seen Otter AI? Not only is it perfect and on the money, it knows when I'm using slang and it changes it. It's amazing. So technology is moving forward and we have to sort of go with it and meet the needs of our students with this idea in mind.
You know, novel thought, right? We need to educate ourselves. We need to pay attention to individuals as people, right? We need to be innovative. And we need to think about what benefits everyone, right? Like this isn't rocket science, right? Like this, you know, so you know, it always frustrates me when we think about social change and we think about justice, and when we really look at what the answers are and they're, you know, common sense. It really frustrates me to know that we aren't making those decisions, and we're sometimes valuing budgets or outdated or anti-racist or policies that create barriers. And so thank you for sharing that. You know, when we talk about accommodations, you know, I think about K-12, I think about the IEP, right, which could be for any student on a spectrum where they have any kind of needs or any, you know, or they need any accommodation to be successful in the classroom. I think about different community college campuses and higher education campuses where it differs based on the institution in terms of what a student needs to demonstrate that they need accommodation, whether it's self-report or whether, you know, maybe unfortunately a college is still using that medical model, and now we're asking the student to go back and forth to the doctor between the school day when they have to go to class and get documentation, right? And then in the private sector where maybe you're just dealing with your human resources office, right? So when we talk about these different environments where accommodations have to be given, from your perspective, what are the major differences in accessing an accommodation, and just general thoughts on what we should be doing or the differences that we should be aware of as we are working with students who may be getting advising and will go out and get a job, or who are transitioning into a college from a K-12 setting. What, you know,
So Ryan, I love that last sentence that you said. That language right there is where I listened to what Lesley said earlier about the social model of disability versus the medical model of disability and the social justice model of disability, and all of that is old news in New York. That's all. You know, I feel like we've definitely started to embrace that. At least most of the SUNY campuses have really started to embrace that. In fact, we have learning management systems now that you know, that speak to universal design by by allowing students to download different formatting of their own materials, just putting them right in the driver's seat. But so I feel like universal design and the social model of disability is an essential part of the discussion. But in my world, we're there. What I think we need to do is add practical functionality to our learning tools. I think the philosophical shift is there, but I think we need to start adding functionality to some of our learning management systems and some of our student portals and some of that. And that goes back to the tech world. I mean, that goes back to throwing your tentacles out before you purchase technology and asking the people that build the technology to create an accessible tool before you buy it, right? So I feel like where we need to, Ryan, your statement had to do with teaching teachers to teach accessibly in the education for education students, and then you jumped to the workplace. And that's where I feel like I've been focusing my attention. I've been focusing most of my attention on our education students and making sure they understand how to create accessible materials. And then I've been trying to partner with the career externship office about talking to our local employers about accessibility. The middle ground, I feel like, is a part where we've made great success in the educational environment, but we need to sort of teach our teachers how to teach accessibly, and we need to create understanding in the employment end when our students graduate and go out into the workforce. In fact, at our all college meeting this year, I sat next to an instructor who I identified because of the activity that she was performing during the all college meeting. And I said, there aren't enough breaks in this meeting, are there? And she said, no, there aren't. And it's amazing to me how much they did for me in college about that. But when you get to work, even out of college, there's nothing.
Mm.
So
Yeah, letting our students know, kind of back to your question, Ryan, about the differences between K through 12, college, and employment. I think one of our biggest roles in college is we're the intermediary. So we get them straight from high school where they work under some different laws and they have guaranteed success. So they are an American citizen, they get that diploma.
Much better if I can get familiar with the way.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
I thought someone's talking. And then in college, right, we guarantee them access. So they have the right to participate in every single program and activity, just as every single other person. And we kind of remove those barriers so that everyone's on what we would call a level playing field. And then when it gets to work, that's very different. Yes, they definitely have laws that they follow, but every workplace and every job is a little bit different. If you would have told me that I would have gotten accommodations at work, even though I worked in this position, in an ADA position, I didn't know until one of my colleagues was like, hey, you should do this. You should go talk to HR. And I was like, oh, you're right, the ADA, like the law, I could get some accommodations, right? And it's hard to kind of advocate for yourself, especially when there's so much money, resources, and insurance on the line, right? Of what can I do? What can't I do? How can I disclose? How can I not disclose? And so it is our job, I believe, in higher education to kind of prepare students for that. So I oftentimes, when I'm talking to students, let them know, hey, did you know that I have accommodations? This is something that you can ask for in a future position. Or if they're looking for a work study position, I say, you should really go talk to HR and ask them what might be appropriate for that, because just like the classroom, your work might have some barriers too. So while we do work under different laws, we're all really trying to move towards the same goal, which is to help support people, help them in their own personal identity, whether that's their disability identity or other things, and help them to be successful humans.
Thank you. Oh, you're on mute, Lesley. So Lesley's on mute, so she's going to work through that real quick. And thank you for those answers. Yeah, I'm gonna just stray a little bit, right? As you guys are talking about this is it's making me think about a student that I knew who struggled with dyslexia for years and was afraid. Well, first of all, didn't have the resources or the support to identify that he had dyslexia. And then once he found out and went to college, was really afraid to go get the accommodation. Self-confidence, stigma, a variety of things. And earlier we talked about, on average, maybe 20 to 25% of folks on our campuses may need an accommodation. And we know that every student who needs an accommodation on campus isn't asking for one or isn't receiving one. How do we help students? How do we create the environment where it's safe for a student who needs an accommodation to get one? And how do we provide that protection that they need to feel comfortable to get the services that they require? And I'm not sure if Lesley's back. and able to come off mute, but let's go Emily and then Catherine, and then we'll see where we are with with Lesley.
So Ryan, that's a really great question. One of the things that every school should be doing is really disaggregating the data that they have on their student population to see which marginalized identities are not being served. So for example, at a previous institution I worked at, our students of color, the rates that we were seeing them for accommodations was much lower than for our white students. Same for first generation students versus students that, maybe had parents that went to school that knew about accommodations and things like that. So I do think that we are reaching a lot of students, but we might not be reaching the students that we need to be. And so what about our services, or what about our kind of like, let's say, advertising is not reaching certain populations, and why? So at this previous institution that I worked at, we found that our documentation policy was what was holding students back. So our low income students and our students of color didn't have the same access to documentation that our white affluent students did. And so because of that, they might have even been coming in for a first appointment, but they weren't getting approved for accommodations because there was a barrier there. So even though our goal as an office, right, is to remove barriers, we were creating a new one, a new hurdle for students to jump over. And so we really started to evaluate that policy, because it's a policy rooted in white supremacy. And so, the written word is the law. And so what would be different if we took self-report, the verbal word of a student, as the highest form of documentation, which is what AHEAD guides us to do now. And so when we do start evaluating our policies and procedures and reaching out to students that maybe think that there's a barrier that we now have removed, we really can start reaching a larger population and gaining the trust of the public. Because when we were turning away students for accommodations that desperately needed them, we lost trust, and rightfully so.
Catherine, any thoughts there?
Well, I think, I think the way that you make students feel comfortable accessing your office is to become involved across campus, to be at every event, to be visible, I have a couple signs in my office that say, safe space for the LGBTQIA community. I have, and it's really embracing differences, and just put yourself out there as somebody that embraces differences and is non-judgmental. And then the other important piece, I think, is you have to meet them where they are. So this is an educational institution, and for the longest time, the student services side of the house was not allowed to have a presence on the learning management system. That was for faculty only. And at some point, I believe I appealed to faculty council and said, I need to have a course in Blackboard to communicate with my students, to post announcements, to invite them to events, to make them feel like this is as important a part of their educational experience as their coursework is. And it was allowed, and I feel like I have garnered a lot of support from my students because of that, where the students also start to feel like respect me as an education professional. And it's not shameful to be coming to my office because I'm just another professor, I'm just another education professional on campus. That's my answer to that.
Thank you. And Lesley, wanted to come back to you. You had some thoughts right before we had a little technical difficulty there. And then also, if you want to add to the question we were just talking about, which was creating a safe environment for students to come in and get accessibility services. I shared about a student who suffered from dyslexia who, was afraid for a variety of reasons to come in and access services.
Okay, yeah, really quick. K through 12 college versus employment. Having run this gamut, K through 12, for the most part right now, after 1973, you started seeing students coming in. And then post probably 1980, when it actually got underway, that it became a very sort of bubble effect almost. It was a concierge service where a student just moved through the grades and really didn't have to do anything. It was taken care of for them. Go here, do this. Very passive. They get to college, and unless somebody's told them that this is going to be different, they have no idea. I have to show up with paperwork. I have to file it. I have to do I have to request this. It's a shock for a lot of people. So that's the difference. But employment gets trickier. I tell all of my students, do not disclose your disability until you have gotten the job offer and are already there. Because even though it's against the law to discriminate against you, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I wish the world was a nice place where discrimination didn't happen, but truthfully it does. Then I also tell students and their parents, if they'll listen, that there is a program called 55B within federal hiring. 55B looks for people with disabilities. 55B is the government wanting people with disabilities. Things such as disability coordinator for FEMA. They actually have that. Disability coordinator in different cities. They actually have that. And if you are a verified, and we're back to medical model, documented person with a disability, your resume goes to the top of the pile. Okay, this is a wonderful thing and people need to know about it. So there are different times that you disclose and different times that you don't, and you just have to know how to navigate this system. In terms of safe environment, I think that I may be in the vanguard because I came to disability knowing that I'd been constantly told throughout K through 12 that I wasn't trying, and I knew darn well I was. Then getting to college and having a professor go, so how many hours are you putting in studying for this? You know, you're the top student in the class. I said, oh, 35. He goes, for all your studies? I said, no, for this class per week. He said, oh, you need to get over to disability services. And I was lucky enough to be at a community college where they had someone that could actually administer different testing that I needed. And that testing followed me through most of my post-secondary education. When I got to law school, I found out that it was a whole different ballgame and I was going to need this re-upped every 3 years, even though my invisible disabilities were not going to go away. Come to find out though, students with very visible disabilities in certain institutions or certain types of institutions, the gated professions, basically you have to reprove that you have CP. You must reprove that you're in a chair. You must reprove, I mean, over and over and over again. So I can tell you tons of stories about that. But in terms of a safe environment, I guess I operate within the Center for Academic Success. So there's a lot of people here. There's tutoring, there's the writing center, there's academic skills, and there's me over in this office. But I do have a tendency to meet students, go out, talk with them. I'm having dinner on the quad. We're getting to-go salads and sitting 6 feet apart tonight because a lot of my students do embrace their disabilities. The older ones especially, if they have listened to things that come out of disability advocacy, they are strong advocates and they're going to go on in the world and be strong advocates for people with disabilities. So I think I think this generation is a new and different generation than mine. Mine were far more afraid. And this ableism is something that is learned, and ableism is something that you may have picked up during K through 12. This idea of shame, of hiding. But once you reach college level, you find that there are a lot of people who are willing to talk about disability, you know, use the word, as Lawrence Carter Long says, and that are proud of it. It is a safe environment, but I do treat people as they wish to be treated in terms of everything is very confidential. If people want to sit back and have just their accommodations go through quietly, then that's what happens. If they want to join me and sit around and talk about it, sure, because that's what I experienced. When I went to the University of California, San Diego, there was this wonderful lady who led disability services. Her name was Robbie Gimlet. And she hired only people, well, it seemed to me anyways, only students with disabilities to be running the parts of her office. So going there was almost a constant disability advocacy thing. We go out on the picnic tables and we just talk about 504. That's where I really started to learn about it. We talk about the history of disability. And once you start understanding that this is an identity, then it becomes easier to embrace it. And I'm not saying that someone who's just recently had a diagnosis is going to jump in and embrace it. I am not saying that there is not pain or suffering that comes along sometimes with disability, but I am saying that a lot of people embrace it and a lot of people wouldn't change it for the world. So.
Thank you. Two quick questions from the audience. The first, really quick, I think is for you, Lesley. You mentioned an initiative, is it 55B?
Yes, correct. It's B. B as in boy. And if you look up on usadjobs.com or jobs.org, which, believe it or not, I know it sounds like some sort of shady place, but it's actually where the federal government puts their jobs, believe it or not. And it goes into great detail of how you get this moniker. And the jobs are really good ones. Now, understand that the federal government runs jobs from ones that are for people who have no college education, like working in a USDA position, to recent college graduates, to people with master's degrees and PhDs and JDs, and all over the United States. So you can use this gigantic job finding application to find anything in your area, anything that is specific to disability. It's marvelous.
Awesome, thank you. And then another question that came from the audience was looking at the models that colleges or accessibility centers are using. What are some of the models that you recommend and why, whether it's social justice, medical, or any other models that are out there? Just kind of throw it out there for whoever wants to take this one. What do you recommend, and maybe how do you shift to get there for someone who may not be there?
I think the field for a long time has been stuck in the medical model. And it's very documentation heavy. We want to see that diagnosis. We want to see pervasive barriers and how they impact you, and only do what is reasonable in our minds. And also, when you're working from the medical model, there's this idea that people don't want disabilities, that they want to be cured from them, and that they are inherently bad. Although I might have pain from my disability, but not change it, not for a second. And so I think that it's really important that we move away from that. And we started to go more towards like the social model, which is better. But really we want to go to the social justice model. And that is what is freeing for everyone. It is creating equity to begin with, instead of having to add in accommodations later, making students self-disclose, things like that. We are working on student self-report, which is one of the biggest things that I push for, because documentation can be so harmful to students in so many different ways, and there's so many barriers to it. And the social justice model also takes into account the intersecting identities that all students have, right? So whether they're a woman, low income, a person of color, in the LGBTQ community, it takes that into account, and it's looking at how all of those things interconnect and impact your ability to be successful in all areas of life and what your opportunities are like. So that's where I would recommend that our offices go to. But I know that that can be a difficult transition, as we probably see in all of our head meetings, working with different offices, is that we're on all different kind of parts of the spectrum when it comes to the models that we work within.
I agree with Lesley in that the social justice model of disability is the model that allows us to work with the students more holistically than any other model I've ever seen. And so, but I think as directors of accessibility services, and I think there's a lot of them on this webinar, be the change that you want to see in the world. Be a professional on your campus and present on the social model of disability, the social justice model of disability, and this philosophical shift. And I think what you'll see is that the other education professionals on campus start to think about that when they're designing their courses and when they're purchasing technology. And it's really just a matter of sometimes presenting the idea for people to think about.
Yeah, I think it's a conversation sometimes. I'm preparing a short 60-minute presentation that we're doing with our DEI stuff. And I've entitled mine Everything You Want to Know About Disability, but We're Afraid to Ask. So it's very much, I'm presenting it in, I'm not going to go into the epistemologies of the patriarchal hierarchy within the social context of disability. I'm not going to do that. I'm laying it out flat, sort of like, if I was to tell somebody who has no idea, never heard of disability before, what are the most interesting key points to this? And like, what is disability? It's easily answered. And then things like, how does faculty don't know how these accommodations happen? I mean, I'm shocked. They go, well, how do you determine that someone has this disability? I'm like, I don't. I mean, if it's like a cancer diagnosis, I'm relying on an oncologist to tell me about this. And so, yeah, the medical model, I don't like the paperwork. I don't like that we have to rely on it. But on the other hand, an oncologist really is in a better position to tell me the functional limitations of someone and how it works and how I can help the student overcome it. Because oftentimes students are in a position where I say, what could we do to help you? And they don't know.
I agree, actually.
Yeah. And so it stinks because but here's what I can do. I can describe things. I can show them Otter AI. And when I say, well, we used to have like physical human note takers and they would take notes for you. So you don't have to concentrate on the notes. You can concentrate on the lecture. But now we have this thing, check this out. And it's great because it never has illegible handwriting. It's never absent from class. It never forgets to send you the notes. It's right there and you can go back, fiddle around with it, add graphs and illustrations and things like that. So it's by showing the students sometimes that I can show them what they need. But oftentimes a physician or a therapist or somebody who has worked with them for a long period of time knows what they need. And sometimes that need is not even accommodation related. It's sometimes more of things that we have available for everyone. The writing center, tutors, academic skills. So I try to shift them over that way. And because I exist within this realm of the Center for Academic Success, I'm lucky that I'm surrounded by it. So it's not hard to get people over there.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be awesome to be in a place where self-report or referral kind of led the access to the accommodation, and then the paperwork or the medical model then was additional support or additional information used to help the student not be the barrier to get into accessing services. And so speaking of barriers, and we're getting close to our time, what are the barriers in your opinion? And this could be hurtful. We've got colleagues who are listening, but sometimes we are the barriers ourselves, right? And so from your perspective, what are the barriers that you face or that you see the most when it comes to providing accommodations on your campus, and what do you wish we could do about it?
I think
I'll start out. I'll just say the greatest challenge for me at the present time is keeping up with the changing needs of our students, with the changing needs of our community businesses, which employ our students, and our institutional structure, which really should serve as a scaffolding of support for them. And institutional structure is ever changing recently. So we almost don't know where to throw them a net anymore. It's the constant rate of change, quick rate of change lately. I think that is our biggest challenge. And
yeah, Emily, you were going to say?
yeah, I see our biggest challenge as being accountability, and a lack of accountability for institutions, staff, faculty. When we think about kind of like other laws and what our responsibility is in them, like FERPA and Title IX, we get training every year, or at least at the institutions that I've worked at, and there are big consequences if you do not follow those, right? The HR meetings, performance plans, things like that. What I have noticed with the ADA is that sometimes our letters of accommodations or the things that we say are needed for accessibility are almost seen as like, this is a gentle suggestion. Please do this. This would be so nice. And when it's not done, it's a, sorry, I forgot. Oh, that's just not going to work for me or for my class. Or, well, if that student can't do this way, they shouldn't be in college. And there's not really any repercussion for that. Schools take big risks every day by not making things accessible. And they're taking the risk of a lawsuit or an OCR complaint. And I'm hoping that we can change this accountability structure to be something where instead of waiting for the lawsuit to make a change, why don't we just do it right the first time? Instead of spending millions and millions of dollars to fix our websites, make it right the first time. Have it as not an option to be accessible, but a necessity. So that's where I see the biggest obstacle for me in is kind of the barrier that I run into every single day.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm really lucky in that I'm at an institution, we're small, 2,000 students. There's a zeitgeist in the place that's unusual. And I mean, this is coming from a person who's worked at different colleges, gone to a lot of conferences, that this has been my whole life. So I've seen a lot of colleges and how they interact with people with students with disabilities and what the sort of ableism is on campus. I mean, ableism is everywhere, but for the most part, I'm very lucky in that our upper administration addresses ableism in a really good manner. For those of you who don't have that, what I would say to you is go and find the influential person within a department. That influential person, whether it's the department chair or whether it's someone else within them, explain disability to them, work with them. That is the person who will influence others within that department. And it's usually within departments that I've seen it. I haven't seen ableism that spreads across an entire campus because this is 2021. We're not back in 1973, thank goodness. But I think that's the way to do it. The biggest problem, I think, is people's lack of knowledge. I do not think that people are trying to be jerks or ableists. They just don't realize they are. Mm-hmm. And that's something that has to be overcome. If you guys get a chance, read the book called Academic Ableism.
Oh, I read it, yeah.
Yeah. I got to lead a group and share it with about 20 people on my campus. And they were really stunned about a lot of things that were in there. It touches on some things that I wish it went deeper into, but it'll give you a good idea on perhaps where things should go.
Awesome, thank you. We are unfortunately at our time, and we could have this conversation for many, many more hours. So what I do recommend is do that. Take this conversation back to your campuses, ask these questions, bring these directors, bring these topics and questions up in your team meetings. Set up time with your human resource directors and presidents and bring this stuff up. As an administrator myself, one of the things that I often find is that sometimes when I'm a layer or two removed from students, I don't have the luxury that I had when I was an advisor to see what's happening on the ground to be able to make an impact. And so sometimes it's as simple as having a conversation. You'd be surprised what happens once educators know that there's a challenge that we need to solve. I believe that we wake up and do this work because we're superheroes. I believe that everybody's here and we really want students to self-actualize into what it is they're supposed to be. So I encourage you to do those things, but let's give snaps, rounds, kudos in the chat, all of that to our amazing panelists, Catherine, Emily, and Lesley. Thank you guys so much for helping us kick off this conversation for the year with Global Minded in the Colorado Community College System, and for everybody else in the chat. To everyone in the chat, we're looking forward to seeing you next month. We are back on, the third Tuesday of the month, 2 p.m. Same bat time, same bat channel if you're into the old Batman shows. And we will see you next month. Thank you for getting comfortable being uncomfortable, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
I just want to say thank you. This was really nice. I enjoyed it.
Thank you guys so much. Yeah.
I'll definitely be going to your other events. And I'm going to encourage folks that I know to do so as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it was absolutely a pleasure. And so, and you can share with your colleagues and anybody else that this will be, we sent the email, but this will be available on YouTube, on the website. So this is one of those things that will be around for a while, and we can use it to bring this conversation to other folks. So don't hesitate to do that at all. And Celeste, as always, thank you so much.
It was fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Really, it'll be on the, we'll have it on our website posted tomorrow, and as well as on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much.
All right, you guys have a great afternoon, everyone.